Hi guys! Today we are talking all about lying. Kent Hovind says that science textbooks are lying to us. I say he is lying about them lying. He says I am lying about him lying about them lying. It's lieception here. It's all kicking off. It's craziness. Let's just jump into the video. If you've not seen the first two videos in this series, I thoroughly recommend you go check them out. I'll link them below. But if you do want to skip them for whatever reason, because you know, I can get a bit boring I guess, a little bit rambly, here's a summary. Kent Hovind says science textbooks are lying about nearly everything. However, the problem is, Kent Hovind doesn't understand basic science. That's pretty much it. That's all we talked about for two videos. And we're going to do it for a third, because I must be a masochist. We are currently at the point in the book where he's going through a series of lies that he thinks that textbooks tell us, mostly to do with evolution, because he doesn't believe in evolution. As we saw in the first video, he has a really weird, warped definition of what evolution actually is. Go watch that if you've not seen it already, it's kind of ridiculous. Oh, Karuri's making her bed again, aren't you? We are kind of stepping things up a little bit in this video because we're finally reaching the stuff that, you know, unlike Kent, I actually studied pretty in depth at an accredited university. So this is the stuff that I know about, the kind of genetics, the cell biology, the human biology, this kind of aspect of it. Last time we were talking a lot about like some geology bits and stuff like that, which is not my area of expertise. This stuff, I still wouldn't call myself an expert. I'm nowhere near the level of some incredible people, but this is what I know. This is what I studied at university. Yeah. It's kind of my thing. Now, the final thing I want to address before we, like, jump into reading any of the book itself, I know, I'm sorry, lots of admin at the beginning, it must get boring, right? But the final thing I want to discuss is that Kent has been making some video responses to me, and I'm aware these exist, but I've not watched them yet. Actually, I tried to watch a bit of, like, his first one, it got kind of boring, and he's made two more since then. Anyway, I am aware that they exist. I've not seen them. So before any of Kent's fans come at me with any more Christian love, so loving, I will say this now. I'm going to continue making these videos about the book as I have planned them and researched them and already like basically, not scripted, but like bullet pointed them out, what I want to talk about. I'm going to keep making these videos as planned. I'm not changing that. I'm not responding to Kent straight away. I've already said I'm not going to debate him, but at the end of this series of videos, I may look at his responses and then make one final response to his responses, if that makes sense. But I'm not going to get into a back and forth on every video with him because I think that's a waste of everyone's time. But yeah, like I say, if there is a response to his responses to me, responception, it's not going to be before I'm done dissecting this book and the bad science in it, because I want that to be the focus. And I don't want this series to devolve into what he has already tried to make it, which are his like childish cries of like, oh my god, I'm like totes destroying her, and then him spelling my name wrong and yeah. So where we are in Kent Hovind's Are You Being Brainwashed book is at lie number 7, which is where Kent tells us he doesn't think vestigial organs or structures exist in any animal ever. There's a lot in this, and I don't actually want to focus on the vestigial organs bit for this. I want to focus on one really interesting line he says. It's kind of a sarcastic comment on the claim that he's making, where he says, by the way, even if there were vestigial organs, there are not. Isn't that losing something, not gaining something? Is that how evolution works? You lose things until you have everything? And I really wanted to talk about this and focus on it because, again, it's a blatant misunderstanding of what the whole process of evolution is. For one thing, there's no conscious effort behind evolution. It's not a definite progression in one way or another to lose or gain things. There's no ultimate goal with it. It's just a series of changes. Sometimes random mutations happen, and sometimes those mutations result in genes being expressed differently. And every so often, those gene expressions are useful to an organism in the environment that it's living, and those organisms will be more likely to survive to have offspring, which will have that same mutation passed on to them, and over generations, those genes become dominant. That's all it is. It's not gaining or losing anything. There's no conscious actor behind it. There's no one pushing things in a certain direction. There's not even like a certain direction that things are going in where we always lose or gain something. It's just a series of events. And so reading this sarcastic comment in the book and reading a lot of the comments from Kent's fans on my last few videos, I've kind of become aware that Kent Hovind and his fans don't understand the basics of how evolution happens, which is why I want to take a few moments at the beginning of this video to kind of jump into the science, go way back to basics, explain the process of evolution by natural selection as simply as possible, right down to the cellular level. This is complicated stuff. I can't cover every detail. There's a hell of a lot more here that I'm not covering. I'm basically covering this to like maybe an A-level biology standard, but there's a hell of a lot more I could talk about. We could go into more of the details about how these events like transcription and translation and everything actually happen. We could talk about that in more detail, but for simplicity's sake, I don't want to jump ahead too far and get into that kind of deep level just yet, because I think we need to explain the basics first. And so this is going to be a kind of oversimplified basic explanation of how mutations arise, what DNA is, and how all this influences or leads to evolution by natural selection. Inside the nucleus of our cells and the cells of all living things, there are these little molecules called nucleotides. Nucleotides are the organic monomers that make up DNA and RNA. Nucleotides are made up of a phosphate group, a 5-carbon sugar, or a pentose sugar, some people call it, and a nitrogen-based base. In DNA, this base can either be thymine, adenine, guanine, or cytosine. For simplicity's sake, I'm leaving out the differences with RNA for now, but basically, the DNA of all living things is made up of nucleotides with these 4 bases. It doesn't matter if it's a single cell, or a plant cell, or a fish, or a complex mammal. Everything is made up of these 4 basic monomers. The basis for all living things is fundamentally the same. And what I want you to remember now is that these monomers aren't in themselves living, which means that the basis for all living things is a non-living thing. So when people say, how can you get a living thing from non-living, we are all made up of non-living things. The boundary between living and non-living is kind of complicated and cloudy and messy, but again, that's a topic for a whole other video. So the phosphate group of one nucleotide will form a covalent bond with the sugar group of another nucleotide, and so this ends up forming a big long string of nucleotides. Base pairs that aren't attached to anything will then usually form hydrogen bonds with the other base pairs of other nucleotides, and then they, as they match up, kind of like form the covalent bonds with the ones next to them, and you end up with these 2 strands of nucleotides attached at the sides by covalent bonds and in the middle by hydrogen bonds. These bases kind of pair up, so guanine always bonds with cytosine and thymine always bonds with adenine. These 2 connected strands of nucleotides are DNA, and DNA can be hundreds or thousands or millions of nucleotides long. Within this like millions long chain, stretches of these nucleotides can have specific functions, usually to do with building proteins, but not always. And these specific kind of areas of the chain are called genes. While it's easy to make a claim like there's a gene for blue eyes, for example, the gene itself isn't creating an entire blue eye. One gene might just be responsible for creating the pigment that goes into our irises, while another gene is responsible for creating the muscle in our eye, another gene is responsible for building the lens, and so on. There's a lot more that goes into kind of like building a part of an organic living thing than just one single gene. Usually it's lots of genes working together to produce different components that make up us and who we are. It's nowhere near as simple as just one gene for one eye, one gene for arms, one gene for lungs. It's nothing like that. Far more complex. Some genes are long, some genes are short. Some genes create really complex proteins, some genes create really small, simple proteins. Through transcription, DNA is converted to mRNA, and then mRNA works with ribosomes to create proteins. Every 3 bases in the mRNA are like a code, and each of these either codes for like stop or one of 20 amino acids. The ribosome reads these 3 little bases and says, okay, well this means I need to pick this amino acid, and it picks that amino acid, and then it reads the next 3 bases and says, okay, I need to pick this amino acid, and it attaches it to the last one. And that's how it builds proteins. But not all bits of DNA encode protein sequences. We call these bits non-coding DNA, but they do have a variety of functions and purposes, usually they're there to be regulatory. So they look after how ribosomes are building proteins or so on. They have lots of different functions. Just because they're not building the protein, it doesn't mean they're useless or junk. These bits are also usually where we look for markers to try and identify people and so on. Sometimes DNA can be affected by mutations. Mutations are permanent changes to the sequence of DNA. Mutations can range from a single nucleotide being altered to a string of nucleotides being altered or removed or added or changed in some way. Most DNA mutations occur as a result of errors when the DNA is copied or by a strand of DNA being affected by environmental factors. When mutations are found in the DNA of gametes, then there's a chance that these are going to be passed on to the person's offspring, which is how genetic mutations are passed on from generation to generation. There are many different kinds of mutation. Some are known as substitutions, and this is where one nucleotide in the code, in the string in the chain, is accidentally switched with another nucleotide. Some are deletions, where a nucleotide or series of nucleotides are just completely missed out of the chain completely. They're just not added in there during transcription or translation or something. And some mutations are known as insertions, which is where random nucleotides or series and chains of nucleotides are accidentally added into the sequence. Again, usually during transcription or translation or whatever. In some cases, this has absolutely no effect on the protein being made. Sometimes different little codes of the bases can code for the same amino acid, so this might have no noticeable effect even if there is a mutation. However, in some cases, a mutation can cause an effect to be noticed. For example, it may cause a wrong amino acid to be added to a protein, which means the protein won't function properly, which means we may notice the effects kind of physically. It may cause a protein to stop being built, or it may cause a protein to just kind of carry on being built and built bigger than it should be. And again, this will stop it functioning as it should. Not every mutation has an effect on how a gene is expressed. Some have no effect at all, but mutations are actually fairly common. And when mutations do have an effect on gene expression, sometimes they're minor, sometimes they're major. There's no correlation between the number of, bases that have been added or changed or taken away, and how big the actual kind of gene expression change is. For example, you can have one tiny base substituted out, and it can lead to a huge, huge change in how a gene is expressed. Or you could have a random code inserted in by accident, and through luck and chance, it has no impact on how genes are expressed, or at least no noticeable impact on it. So it is a lot more complex than it might seem. A mutation is not a conscious way of saying add this or take this away from an organism. It's not saying, okay, I'm going to add a third eyeball. It's not saying, okay, I'm going to take away this arm. It's simply a small error in the code which may or may not alter how a gene or genes are expressed, which in turn may or may not alter how a protein is made or how a cell functions. To look at an example, take a person with sickle cell anemia. What happens there is that inside all of our DNAs, we all have a gene that helps make hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what helps red blood vessels transport oxygen around the bloodstream. So everyone has this gene that makes protein. And in people with sickle cell anemia, there's one small part where one base is switched out for the wrong one. And as a result of this one single base being switched, when the ribosomes in the cells come to make the hemoglobin, it's not really the right shape. It kind of still works, but not really. It kind of all clumps together, and it stops the red blood cells from being able to properly carry oxygen. And so obviously this affects people on a physical level because, they struggle with exercise because they can't carry as much oxygen in their blood and so on. It's not always that simple. It's often a lot more complex. Often just mixing up one base won't have such a big drastic effect on a person physically, but sometimes it does. It's all down to kind of chance and luck and, it's all very complicated. One website I found puts it all a lot better than I ever could by saying, in many cases, evolutionary change is based on the accumulation of many mutations, each having a small effect. Whether the mutations are large or small, however, the same change of causation applies. Changes at the DNA level propagate up to the phenotype. So how does this relate to evolution? Because I know I've been kind of throwing a lot of heavy science at you here. As we've established, sometimes changes or mutations in the DNA affect how genes are expressed, right? And a change in gene expression can be good or bad or unnoticeable. It's not a matter of add or taking away a structure or something like that from a living organism, just a matter of changing the underlying code that builds that structure. If there are noticeable changes in gene expression, and these are negative and hinder the organism in some way, then the organism may not survive long enough to have any children to pass on these negative or harmful genes to. So they die out. But if the expression of the mutation is advantageous, if it helps the organism in the environment that they currently live in, that organism is probably more likely to survive, is more likely to have babies and have more babies with which to pass these genes onto. And then these kids with that mutation will have a higher chance of surviving and passing their genes on and so on. Sometimes things do go wrong and the negative mutations somehow end up being passed on and kind of like quite prominent. Sometimes mutations can have one negative side effect and one positive side effect. Like I say, it's all very complex. I'm just trying to explain this as simply and as basically as possible, but there's a lot more to it than just this. Like I say, over time, mutations and changes in gene expression build up throughout a population, and while each step of change may be very small, over millions of years, we do see them build up to big, big changes. And this is the bit in particular that I think people like Kent Hovind and his fans kind of struggle to get their head around, because they're like, they can't quite see the big picture, and they can't quite see how these small changes build up to something so big. But it is possible with time. I want to give you an analogy about one of my favourite things in the world to try and make this a little bit clearer. Let's imagine you're baking cookies, and you have a basic cookie recipe that you always follow. You have a list of ingredients and a list of rules for how to mix them. This is your DNA. You make cookies for everyone you know, and these people are all kind of split up into groups. We're going to focus on 3 groups in particular today. One is a group of kids, one is a group of elderly people, and another is a group of athletes, let's say. So you bake your basic cookie recipe every day, sometimes several times a day. You bake a lot of cookies, and everyone likes your cookies well enough. But this one day you accidentally add a little bit more sugar into one of your recipes by accident. Turns out the kids love these super sweet cookies. They go crazy for them. So now you take that feedback and you say, oh, well, these guys like this. These guys didn't really mind. So now you start making 2 different batches of cookies. You've got your regular cookies for the elderly people and the athletes, and your sweet cookies for the kids. Another day, you add in a little bit of extra flour by mistake, and the elderly people, they grumble because this makes the cookies really hard, and, they can't chew them with their false teeth, so like, you throw out that batch of cookies, you get rid of the recipe where you put in too much flour, and you go back to what you were doing before. Regular cookies for the elderly and the athletes, sweet cookies for the kids. Another day you're baking your batches of cookies again and you accidentally drop in a bunch of nuts into the mix. It turns out the athletes love them because all this extra protein, it's great for like building up muscle and doing whatever athletes do, I don't know. The kids don't like it so much, the elderly don't like it so much, it gets stuck in their teeth, the kids are like, this is too healthy. So now you're making 3 different batches of cookies, regular for the elderly, with nuts for the athletes, and sweet for the kids. You carry on making batches of cookies day after day, and sometimes you switch up the ingredients, sometimes you switch up the method, sometimes you get really positive feedback, sometimes you get negative feedback, and you listen to that feedback, and you adjust your recipes slowly over time. Sometimes you make a change and your friends can't tell the difference between the new cookies and the old ones. Sometimes you make a change and they're like, oh my god, this is amazing, keep doing this. Every time you take that feedback and use it in your new recipe or your next recipe. Over time, your recipe slowly changes, and while not every stage of the recipe is perfect or good, it gets better over time, slowly. Over a series of years, you find yourself using less flour and more eggs for the elderly. You start adding protein powder and taking out some of the sugar for the athletes. For the kids, you start adding more sugar, more sweet things, you start decorating the cookies. Slowly, over hundreds and hundreds of batches of cookies, you're no longer just making simple cookies anymore. The elderly people, you're making fairy cakes. For the athletes, you're making protein bars. For the kids, you're making these intricately decorated gingerbread men. You started with the same recipe and made tiny changes over time. Not all of these worked out. Not all of them were noticed. But you had that same foundation, the same building blocks, and now you're making 3 very different kinds of baked goods for 3 very different people with very different purposes. Once you understand that, and apply it on a huge scale to genetics and DNA and having babies and natural selection, you've got evolution. Lots of tiny, mostly unnoticeable changes happening over a long period of time. And it's only when we look back and compare, animals and species hundreds, thousands of generations apart that we see the big changes. Because generation to generation, they're usually not that noticeable. Anyway, okay, I know that was long. I know that may have been a little tedious for some of you who already know this kind of stuff, but I think it was important and worth saying. And I know it wasn't specifically about vestigial organs, but I think it's very important to cover this. Because based on the sarcastic comment Kent made, I don't think he seems to understand this at all. But Kent, prove me wrong. It's very easy for people to say a dog doesn't give birth to a non-dog. But it's just as easy to say, well, you can't make cakes from a cookie recipe. And you can't. But if you change that recipe a little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit, you'll eventually end up with a cake recipe instead of cookies. And that's evolution. Anyway, now on to line number 8, which is oddly titled, Lie 8. Animals and plants have adapted to their environment. I mean, they have, so... He writes, while it's true that variations happen and animals can adapt within limits, the textbooks teach or imply that there is no limit to the adaptations. Now again, I would like to see an example of this. I've never seen a textbook say there is no limit to adaptations. Because on the one hand, I do agree with it that there are no limits, but the way Kent interprets this is completely ridiculous. Because he comes out with this anecdote which says, one atheist I debated said, given enough time, a cow can adapt to the water and become a whale. Now I don't want to go all no true Scotsman on you, but this atheist that said this is an idiot. And yes, he does deserve to have that statement completely ripped apart because it's nonsense. I don't get too repetitive like the last video, but no cow will ever turn into a whale. That can't happen. That's not evolution. Kent goes on to critique the use of the word adapt because he says that we're only doing it to avoid saying designed because we don't want to admit there's a designer. Or no, we use the word adapt because that's what living organisms do. They adapt, and the environment adapts to us as well. There's no design, there's no proof of a design, there's no proof of a designer. There is proof of adaptation. And it's not just a matter of organisms adapting to their environments, but the environment often adapts around organisms as well. We're not just on this earth because someone put us here. We're here because we are the right kind of organisms to live in this kind of place at this kind of time. He goes on to say that everywhere we look in nature we see evidence of design. The evolutionist would like you to believe that this is just a coincidence and that there really is no design. It is all a result of random accident. Strawmanning again. It's not all the result of a random accident. Yes, mutations may be random and accidental, but they only stick around if they're useful. There's no conscious actor saying pick this one and this one and this one, but there is pressure from natural environments for organisms with certain beneficial traits to be more likely to survive than others. So I guess on one level you could say, well, okay, if we're going to take this back to what started it all, then yes, a lot of us are here because of random mutations and random accidents. But that doesn't mean the entire process was random and accidental. And there are lots of things like this. Just because something starts off as a result of random chance, it doesn't mean the entire process is random. I don't know if it's weird to bring this up as an example, but, since we broke up, but when I met Dan, meeting him at the party that I met him at was completely by accident and random and pure luck that we bumped into each other. But the fact that we kind of started spending time together as friends, and the fact that we cultivated that relationship and built it up to something that was amazing in the end, that wasn't random or accidental. We started out as the consequence of a random action, but that doesn't mean the whole process of our relationship was a random accident. And it's the same with natural selection. Anyway, Ken goes on to talk about the watchmaker analogy, which, I dislike, but he uses painting as an example instead. I always have to say this though, why do people who use this analogy always assume there's an actor and a reason behind something? There isn't. There just isn't. When it comes to natural occurrences, sometimes they just happen. And yes, we can look back and say how something happened, and what it's the consequence of, but that doesn't mean there was a why and a reason, a conscious reason behind it. A chain of events can just lead to another event happening, but that doesn't mean there's an actor behind it all. There's no one planning it out, there's no conscious decision to make it happen. It's just a series of events. When you see it raining, do you stop and think, oh, I wonder who decided to turn the rain on today? No. You don't see a wildflower growing and think, oh, I wonder who planted that. Every time your heart beats, it's not a conscious decision on your part to say, okay, beat, beat, and beat, and beat. No, that happens subconsciously. There's no conscious actor behind it. It's just how your body functions based on signals, and it's how it works. You don't have to consciously guide your body through every step. Events happen without conscious actors all the time. So claims like, it is obvious there was a creator because of the absolute insanity of the contrary, it is impossible that there not be a designer for such a complex universe as the one we live in. Claims like that honestly seem bizarre to me. In line number 9, Kent tries to take on the human eye, or the animal eye, just the eye in general, I think. And what really pleasantly surprised me is that, for once, a creationist doesn't take Darwin out of context here, so good on Kent for doing this, thank you. However, he does ruin it in the next bit where he says, in order to get students to believe that a complex structure such as the eye could have formed by chance, textbooks will often show examples of different types of eyes from reptiles, birds, and even light-sensitive spots from smaller creatures. They will arrange them in the order they choose, claiming that this is an example of evidence as to how the eye evolved. Obviously, arranging things in some type of artificial order is not evidence for anything. But they're not giving it as evidence like that. They're using it to explain how eyes with our structure, for example, aren't the only type of eye that work for an organism. When you see different levels of eye complexity like this, they're not saying this happened to us and then this happened to us and then this happened to us. They're not saying that. They're saying, hey, look, these are all kinds of eye. These are all different levels of complexity of the eye. Living organisms can and do function with different kinds of vision and different kinds of eye and different levels of complexity. It's not all the same level as, say, the human eye. Not every organism needs vision. Not every organism needs the level of control over focal length, for example, that we do. Not every organism needs to be able to see all the colours that we do. Some can see a larger range of light than we can. Some are more sensitive to light and dark than we are. There's lots of different types of eye out there. That sounds stupid, doesn't it? But the thing is, Kent gets this, because he literally goes on to explain evolution by natural selection in the next sentence. He says, each creature in the world seems to have the type of eye that it needs to survive in its environment. Amazing, yes! That's because they evolved to have that. That's because over generations they adapted to their environments until they survive in it. And some animals, some organisms don't have the best eyesight for where they live, and that's maybe because they haven't finished evolving yet. Maybe that's because something went wrong somewhere. But yes, this idea that there are so many organisms out there that do have the perfect eye for their environment is brilliant, and it is proof of evolution by natural selection. But then Kent goes and ruins it by saying, each type of eye is incredibly complex and conspicuously designed. He goes on to say, one textbook states, you can better understand how the eye might have evolved if you picture a series of changes during the evolution of the eye. And then he actually gives us a source for once, which is kind of impressive for Kent, so thank you for that. Please do it more often. He says, apparently this book intends for students to picture or imagine how the eye might have evolved. This is definitely not science. This might be somebody's religion. You know, saying, okay, imagine this, or using analogies, is a pretty common teaching tool. It's not saying, okay, we're going to discover something new today by getting you to imagine it. It's saying, okay, this is what scientists have already discovered and know. To explain it to you guys in a simple way, I want you to imagine this. That's all it is. It's a teaching technique. It's so bizarre that he doesn't get that. It's like me saying, okay, I'm explaining how gravity works. As part of this, I want you to imagine you drop a feather and a rock at the same time. Which lands first? I mean, by Kent's logic, in the rock and feather example, because I use the word imagine in that scenario to teach kids about gravity, then somehow gravity's a lie and doesn't exist anymore. Kent claims that the fact is, the eye is far too complex to have evolved piece by piece. The eye illustrates what is called irreducible complexity. If certain components in the eye are missing, it ceases to function. I completely disagree. I think irreducible complexity, especially in the context of the eye, is complete nonsense. Take away parts of the eye and it won't function exactly as the eye we know today does function, but we know that people do function with less than perfect vision with problems in the eye because we have people constantly wearing glasses. It's not like a circuit board where if you take away one wire, the whole thing stops functioning. You can take away small bits of the eye and it will still work to some extent, just not to the level that we know it today. It's just like the cookie cake analogy again. Not every stage has to be perfect every time. Yeah, if you go back in time, the eye isn't always going to have functioned as well as it does now. It won't have always functioned in the same way that it does now. But who says it always functions like this? No one does. Look at the eye and you take away the muscles holding the lens in place, and you've still got an eye that works to some extent, you just can't change focal length, so you might struggle to see things further away or closer up. Or take away the cone cells in your eye and you can't see colour, but you can still see shapes and textures and patterns using your rod cells. I have spoken about this in other videos, but it is incredibly plausible to think the eye started evolving in small stages over millions of years, initially starting out as one light-sensitive cell, becoming multiple light-sensitive cells, developing cone cells to pick up colours, and adding some neurons to the brain so we can start to consciously and unconsciously interpret these signals, add a lens to focus the light, add muscles to alter the focus. And yeah, vision wasn't always as good as we know it today, but that's okay, because vision developed over millions of years. Like I say, irreducible complexity is often easily debunked. There's lots of ways people can be visually impaired, but still have a functioning eye to some degree. The eye is not irreducibly complex. Oof. Anyway, that's where I think I'm going to end this here. This was quite a science-heavy one. I'm enjoying the science side of things, I'm enjoying making these videos, and I'm enjoying some of the feedback I'm getting, but I'll be honest, Kent Hovind's fans are exhausting, and some of them are just so mean, like not necessarily towards me, just towards people in general. Like, it really kind of shocked me. But there we go. I'm going to keep making these videos, like I say. I'm enjoying them. Let me know what you think of them. Let me know what you thought of this slightly more science-heavy one. Hopefully it wasn't just me talking at you too much, but I do feel like we needed to cover some of those, like, basic bits about, like, genetics and cell biology and so on before we kind of go any further at this point, because, you know, cover the basics before you get any more complex, right? Anyway, I'm going to shut up talking. This has been way too long. Thank you so much for watching today. I appreciate you guys so much, and hopefully I will see you guys again soon. Bye. Thank you so much to everyone supporting me on Patreon this month, with a special thank you going to Data Jack, Gambit and Chauffeur, Love's Pantyhose Addiction, Christian Berg, Jadeon Sheppard, Robert Korte, Peter Kyrouac, Sir Michael Moore, Christina the Atheist, Christian Opitz, Sage Villarreal, Greg Ladd and Loren Hart. You and everyone else supporting me on Patreon is absolutely amazing, and I wouldn't be able to do this without you. Thank you so much.
Roaming for days so I don't have to go home, wasting my time listening to songs you wrote about